Well, hello. My name is Rod Cofield. I'm the director here at Historic London Town and Gardens. And we're trying something new today where London Town and Arundel Rivers Federation are trying to do a virtual joint chat where the focus is mostly on the South River and having a combination of historical information, environmental information, and how our organizations intersect in a variety of ways. This is a bit of an experiment for us, so we're deeply grateful for Arundel Rivers and Jessi, Nancy, and everyone else there for helping us out with this. And I just hope that you enjoy this. But like I said, my name is Rod. I'm the director here at London Town, and we are going to see what information we can pass on to you that is connected to the South River. Hopefully you'll learn something today, and just we'll take it from there, I guess. So I'm going to throw it to you, Jessi, for you to introduce yourself, and we'll see what happens.
Sure. Thanks, Rod. And thanks all of you fine folks out there who are tuning in for this experiment where we explore the intersection of science, conservation, and history here in Anne Arundel County and the South River. I've always really enjoyed the times that we as a federation have been able to do events over at Historic London Town. I tend to try and get there early and revisit some of the plaques and signs that explain the historic significance of the area. And they really do have lingering effects, the colonial and historic land uses of the area on the state of the river today. Unfortunately, not all of those effects are always positive, but some of them I think have been, and it always is really nice to have that historic angle to talk about with folks when we're out exploring the area. As I recall, Rod, London Town is coming up on almost 400 years of history. Is that right?
Goodness, that's some math you're asking me to do kind of early in the day, but I mean, so the colonial, impact here, or the European, population is definitely in the Chesapeake at this point for over 400 years. You do have some Spanish exploration of the Chesapeake that not a lot of folks know about, but then you, of course, get the English doing a lot of their colonization. But of course, we do need to go even before that and talk about the Native American presence in the area, that they're using these rivers to navigate just like the colonials are. They're using the rivers to get their food. Archaeologists love to find oyster middens or other items from the past that really give people an idea of how people are eating in the colonial period and before that. So I definitely need to mention, of course, that there are many thousands of years of habitation here, but of course we know best the colonial period because the record is a little bit more rich and surviving. But the colonials learned a lot from the American Indians in the area, and without them, they would not have been able to really kind of survive the first few decades of being here in the Chesapeake region.
And the oysters, man, they played such a big role in the Europeans' ability to make it here. And it is so fortunate that Native Americans could show them the way. Those oyster middens that you mentioned, I find them all over the watershed. And I really think it's one of the most tangible ways to show people how the Native Americans lived and how long they were here. When you start to explain that entire peninsulas into some of these creeks are built on oyster shells from generation after generation of folks shucking oysters right on the shore and smoking them or eating them right there on the spot. These temporary camps and that got revisited year after year after year for millennia. And then, so many times somebody will start digging a garden and find oyster shells. And really it's neat to know that the history and the past is really so close under our feet. I love pointing out the oyster middens, and actually just last weekend I was with my family at Quiet Waters Park, and out on the end of one of the points into Harness Creek, we saw a bunch of oyster shell and some quartzite stone that is not native to the area. Maybe I'll email you the picture that I took of one of these shards, because I understand that there was some trade with some of the tribes up the Susquehanna and further west that could have brought some of that stone here. I don't know what you found on your grounds about in terms of the archaeological record, but I've been really interested to learn about that.
Yeah, I don't want to stray too far into archaeological knowledge because I would probably get myself in trouble since I'm married to one, and I know quite a few of them. I don't want to tread on anyone's toes and misspeak in any way. But what you were talking about, I find absolutely correct. Where what we think of today as an environmental feature, you just kind of have to scratch the surface a little bit, and you can find evidence that humans, either 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 500 plus years ago, somehow shaped that. And it's just, with a little bit of investigation, it's amazing to kind of see how much of a impact humans have had on the Chesapeake region just for millennia. The trade that you were talking about, yeah, that's my understanding, is that here in the Chesapeake, they are getting items from very far away. And it's, not something I think a lot of folks are really familiar with, that the Native Americans had a fairly robust trade system for a good portion of the East Coast, and I think even farther inland. We're getting beyond my knowledge base at this point, but yeah. And then a lot of that, was essentially disrupted, destroyed, wiped away when the English and the other Europeans showed up. But then they kind of built their society and settlements in a lot of ways on top of what the Native Americans had kind of left behind. And then they just kind of continued the pattern. We humans do that a lot. We just see that what worked for people, decades ago works for us today, and we'll just kind of repeat it. So yeah, there's a lot of impact. And the oysters, I know, are things that if you look at them over time archaeologically, they really give a sense of, in my understanding, you can get a sense of the health of the environment by looking at the records. And oysters, of course, I know play a large part of the health of the system. I'm going to leave all that conversation to you, but I do know that not John White, because that is wrong, John Smith from Virginia, when he was doing a lot of investigations in the Chesapeake going up and down in the early part of the 1600s, he wrote about the size of the oysters and just the abundance of water-based food sources that the local Native Americans were using, and that the English and other colonists would also start to use. You see plates of oysters listed as tavern fare in a lot of the taverns in the area. And of course that, continues today. You have oyster festivals up and down in the Chesapeake region. People love oysters. I love oyster fritters and everything else. So it's something that you can connect across many, many hundreds of years.
Yeah, it was nice, I think, for the early European explorers to encounter such an abundant source of protein. Oysters are all over the world, and obviously the folks coming over from Europe knew what they were looking at, but I don't think they had seen them the way that they were growing here in the Chesapeake. And I once saw an oyster shell that was 7-8 inches long. We don't generally see them get that way anymore, because generally we want them out of the water and in our stomachs before they can get that big. But it's interesting now, during our current COVID-19 pandemic, the oyster industry has been very severely disrupted, and a lot of oysters are not coming to market in the volumes that they used to, and so they're staying in the water. And it's an interesting sort of catch-22 where the bigger an oyster gets, the more water it filters and the more fecund it becomes, the more baby oysters it can produce. But the less saleable it is. You know, folks in the area have become so accustomed to a 3-inch oyster on the half shell at a raw bar that that's sort of what they have come to expect. And like many things, many vegetables, you know, as oysters age, they get tougher. Their meat is not as tender. And I think that those of us who live around here have gotten so accustomed to the half shell serving that many of the good recipes for things like oyster stew and oyster stuffing for, you know, for turkey and things like that have sort of fallen by the wayside, but that's a really good use for those larger oysters. And, you know, I'm no epidemiologist and don't want to get out of my lane here, but if this changes to the market persist for a long time, and these oysters start to grow beyond their usual half shell size, might be a good time to revisit some of those historic recipes and approaches for using oysters that folks did in the colonial period. I don't know if you guys have a cooking section over there at London Town, but maybe that's something to consider, doing a colonial cookbook or something.
Yeah, we have, fortunately, the tenement, the Lord Mayor's tenement, that's a reconstruction, and we do some cooking in. I don't think we've done much on the oyster side. One of my family is from the Eastern Shore, and so one of our Thanksgiving standards is oyster stuffing. So I know exactly what you're talking about. But yeah, I mean, oysters are so big. You even get this crazy colonial recipe that's oyster ice cream. It sounds, yeah, that's the right reaction right there. But man, oysters are all around. And yeah, they even dabbled with an oyster ice cream. I can't remember the cookbook that it comes from, but a local historic house, Hammond Harwood House, has a great cookbook. I think it's called Maryland's Way, that pulls together a lot of these historic recipes, colonial and federal period, a little beyond. But yeah, oysters are all over the place. People are loving them. And oyster ice cream, I've tried it once, but yeah, I wouldn't recommend it.
You know, I'm glad that you mentioned the Hammond Harwood's Maryland Way cookbook, because I actually have that. And it's surprising and very telling, I think, to look at the recipes in there. We went looking for a recipe for crab soup, but along the way found so many creative ways to eat crabs that we wouldn't have thought of. You know, I'm used to crab cakes, steamed crabs, and crab soup. That's about, and crab dip. But there are lots of different ways to cook a crab. And also, it's just interesting to see how scrappy folks must have been back in the olden days, because there are recipes, you know, 4 or 5 different recipes for terrapin, for snapping turtle, and for other dishes that probably would strike modern folks as strange and perhaps unappetizing. I've never had turtle soup, although I'm aware that it's a thing. But, you know, now, as with so many other things, if I were to talk about eating a diamondback terrapin, I would have a number of colleagues that would disown me because they've been such a challenged species over time. And the overfishing of them, I think, is a part of that. And it's certainly the story with oysters. They've been absolutely ravaged by disease, of course, over time, and by habitat loss, but overfishing too. I mean, you know, there was a time when we supplied 2 out of every 3 oysters eaten in the world out of the Chesapeake Bay, and that level of consumption is not sustainable. But it's so good to see aquaculture in the river in the bay starting to take off. I just really hope that the current pandemic doesn't do in too many of these kind of startup aquaculture businesses, because it's going to be really important for the rebound of the oyster population and the recovery of the waters. You know, the numbers of people that have been living here for so long has had historic effects. And I'd like to hear your thoughts, Rod, on agriculture over time. You know, we've seen the Chesapeake region in the late 1800s. You know, people today are often dismayed to see clearing of trees for development and what have you, but a lot of people would be surprised to learn that 130, 140, 150 years ago, there were a lot less trees around here than there are now. And there was certainly a lot less understanding of the impacts of dirty sediment-laden runoff on the rivers and things like that. I think there was probably a lot less care paid for what happened downstream from historic agriculture practices. And of course, we have a rich legacy of tobacco farming here, and tobacco as a plant is incredibly extractive and takes a lot of nutrients out of the soil, and that sort of monocultural production, you know, removes the diversity that holds soil together and keeps it from washing away. I don't know, you know, London Town, could you give us a lowdown on its relationship to the agriculture in the area?
Yeah, my understanding of this, just a kind of an overview, is you're right. There's the tobacco monoculture that's so dominant in the 1600s amongst the various colonies, you know, involving the Chesapeake region. And I mean, that's because tobacco, it's a new world crop. It's an American crop. And of course, people love it when they start to smoke it and do everything else back in Europe. So they can't get enough of it. And the prices are just so high that there's so little incentive in the 1600s, at least, for the colonists here in the Chesapeake to grow anything else other than tobacco and maybe a little bit of corn and some other food. But they're very reliant on the waterways for a lot of their food, because they're so focused on growing essentially money in the colonial period. And then the amount of land that they saw as undeveloped, the colonial saw as undeveloped, just astounded them. So they just kind of didn't care. They knew to a certain extent that, as you said, the tobacco was an extractive plant. You get a few years out of a field, and then you just let it lie fallow for a few decades, and then you come back to it. You know, when the colonists get here, it's what we would call a virgin forest today. So it's a pretty intensive root system. And it really affects how folks, do their farming styles. And then the Chesapeake region, because it's so water heavy, all these creeks and rivers and everything else, it also affects how people populate, where, you know, water access is a key thing. But then, as you're getting at, if you have all of these farms and plantations right up against the water, and you're doing intensive farming by cutting down your trees and not planting them, you just get all the runoff, and it's just it's an issue that, you know, I think we kind of still see today in some ways. It's really not until the second half of the 1700s, or at least my understanding, that you start to have a lot of plantation owners or farmers start to really think about this. They're realizing that, hey, land is actually starting to get a little scarce right now from their perspective. And you do have folks such as George Washington and Jefferson and Madison and others having communications with each other to try to figure out ways to more what we would call environmentally friendly manage their land. They wouldn't necessarily think of it as environmentally friendly. They were just trying to maximize their output. But yeah, it's tobacco, kind of the two modern dividing lines that separate tobacco growing areas from non-tobacco areas. You have the BW Parkway today. So kind of south and east of that is your tobacco growing area in Maryland. North and west of that, you do have some tobacco, but you start to get into some other plants. Eastern Shore, you have quite a bit of tobacco growing as well, but then they start to shift to wheat and some other grains a little earlier than the Western Shore places that had been colonized since the beginning part of the 1600s. I mean, there's just so much of a ripple effect about how everything, came to be, where, before the chat, we were talking about some animals and stuff, and we can get into that. But because tobacco was such labor intensive, and in the first few decades, you had a heavy root system that meant that you couldn't use plows. That starts to affect the different types of large animals that the colonists are bringing in. So they have pigs, and they can kind of fend for themselves. Cows can also fend for themselves. And you might have some horses, but they're not really doing much other than letting people ride on them and show off their wealth. They're not really plow animals or draft animals for a number of years. And sheep and other things that can't defend themselves too easily, you don't find too much in the Chesapeake, at least for the first few decades. And again, that's just because tobacco is so labor intensive that you need your animals and your other plants to be as low maintenance as possible, because you are focusing on growing tobacco, which is your money.
And when the farmers needed to sell it to Europe, as you mentioned, there was this insatiable appetite, nicotine being as addictive as it is. They would come to London town to make those transactions, correct?
Yes. And yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes. Longer answer is, there is not a lot of town development in the Chesapeake. So, London town would attract various people from the immediate area. But once you got to more upriver or in different places of the Chesapeake, what would normally happen is you would get a larger plantation owner who would kind of be the center of trade for that area. And where I'm going with this is, so you might have like someone who has a few thousand acres on the river, and all of his neighbors maybe only have a few hundred acres. So the larger landowner might be the place where 10 or 20 or maybe 30 other planters come, just to make it easier to get the tobacco sorted and shipped out. But the ships are showing up in the late summer, early fall, and they're just going up and down the waterways trying to make as many deals as they can. Some already have contacts here, and some don't. Eventually, you get laws and regulations that start to, codify that in some ways. But at least for the majority of the 1600s and the beginning of the 1700s, it's definitely a much more of a free for all as far as how the tobacco trade is conducted in the Chesapeake.
Yeah, I remember when I first became Riverkeeper, I found a binder that had collected a lot of stories of the South River and of Annapolis in the area, a lot of, photocopies of documents from the Maryland State Archives and things. And one in particular really struck me that was describing, I guess maybe a clearinghouse is what you were describing, this larger plantation being a hub of local commerce. But it was talking about how barges loaded with hogsheads of tobacco would go upriver on the South River past the fork at the headwaters several miles. Mm-hmm. And so for those of you who aren't as familiar with the South River, if you're traveling westbound on Route 50 from Annapolis to Washington, you'll cross over the south in a little blip. It's only about 150-yard bridge or so. But if you were looking to your right, you'd see the river fork at the headwaters. And by the time you get to that place where you see that fork in the river today, at low tide, it's barely even passable in a kayak. It is inches deep. And the tributaries that make that fork are also barely passable in a kayak at low tide. And so to consider that barges. Admittedly, a barge doesn't have huge draft, but it even has the width of something that could carry a hogshead of tobacco. These are big barrels that were filled with leaves and laden with cargo and people that would handle it. And to be able to ply those sorts of vessels miles past this place that you can barely pass with a kayak now really is telling about the historic legacy of that agriculture over time on the rivers. You know, it is sedimented in so many times. And for folks who live on the water, work on the water, or just make sure they keep their eyes out when they cross a bridge around here, there will be times where you've seen a creek or a whole river even turn a nasty brown color, like my creamed coffee here. And that's usually because there's a gigantic sediment spill. And those happen all the time when there is unstabilized soils, or even if there's just a big storm going through an already eroded stream channel, and it can break that channel up and send a big plume of sediment out into the river that will cloud sunlight for days, makes it really difficult for oysters to live, for underwater grasses to live, and consequently makes it really difficult for all the fish and crabs that we love to live in those areas. And you think about how many times that must have happened to turn a navigable waterway into little more than inches deep trickle. But it makes sense. I mean, you know, as we've discussed, folks have been very heavily using this land for coming up on 350, 400 years here. And when you take out the sort of microbiome of the soil by an extractive sort of agriculture like tobacco does, it doesn't hold together very well at all. And a few centuries of that is enough to clog up a river and take a couple miles out of what used to be navigable waterways. It definitely still leaves an effect. And, you know, when they weren't farming tobacco, the early European colonists would have to be farming something they could eat. And so to process the grains, there are a lot of mills there were a lot of mills in the area, and on a lot of the freshwater streams that people barely think about these days. There's a creek running back in their yard or something like that. But they would be impounded. The colonists would come and build earthen dams and set up their mill on the side of it and run those wheels in the stream and grind their corn and grind their wheat and things. And for decades upon decades, these mills would just collect all of the sediment from all the farms upstream, and it would start to make a very fine sediment rich bog, more or less. And eventually they'd get filled up, and the colonists would either have to dredge it out, which I suspect was a really labor-intensive process without modern machinery, or they would simply abandon the mill and move on. And it has happened in Anne Arundel County where historic mill ponds are many feet of fine sediments concentrated in an area that they wouldn't otherwise have been concentrated in. And then particularly bad storm events can cause these impoundments to break open, and all these legacy sediments from decades and centuries ago are re-released in mass into the rivers. And those are the sorts of events that have challenged the Chesapeake's recovery for decades on end and still do today. And it's just another one of those neat links between history and the ecology of what's going on in the waters.
Wow, I didn't know that that type of impact would last for so long as with the sediment explosions. Or I know you used a different term. I just can't remember off the top of my head. But yeah, and I know that so there are some, or at least I believe I know that there are some features of various rivers here that today we may think are natural curves in the river, but were really created by these mills that existed so long ago. When you were talking, you reminded me of, or I thought of a couple of things. One was one of the first, if not the first, eminent domain style law in Maryland involved mill sites. So eminent domain, of course, being that the government or someone can come in and take a little bit of land. And so, there's definitely the fall line and other places where water will move more quickly in the Chesapeake. But once you get to the Tidewater area, the constant flow that you need for a good mill operation, they exist, but they're a little rare, is my understanding. So there was a law passed in the early years of Maryland that allowed the government to kind of set up mills on your property or set aside land if it was good enough for a mill. And then there's a great map that I use a lot for some just research purposes. I think it's from 1798. It's called Thackeray and Valence. You can get it on the Library of Congress Maps website. But it's of the Chesapeake. It shows a lot of the habitation and different locations. But one of the points or one of the symbols on the map that you find a lot of are of mills, because they were such an important component of just how people were using the Chesapeake and the waterways. But yeah, it's not something you think about a lot today. You're right. I don't think about it too much, but they definitely used it.
Yeah, no, I mean, apart from the occasional sort of piece of art where you see a mill depicted with its wheel in a stream or something like that, it's really faded from most people's consciousness that was the way you had to make flour. If you wanted to bake bread, you had to have something to grind your wheat with. And it's really neat. There have been developments or other projects where folks have found these millstones that were used to grind the wheat and corn and things. And I mean, these are massive stones that had to be quarried from, a little bit west of here and brought over and put in place. And then if a mill was defunct for whatever reason, they would just fall down and get buried in the mud, only to be found centuries later and show somebody that never would have noticed. Because like you say, after a couple centuries, you're not going to remember, nobody's going to remember the mill. And when it all grows over, it looks like just a natural feature of the landscape. Like maybe somebody would think that looks like an interesting bump. I wonder why that's there. But you wouldn't find out until you found some archaeological record showing it. And it's interesting too to consider how those streams were flowing differently to make mills a viable proposition, because nowadays here in the Annapolis area especially, when we get a thunderstorm, water just shoots through our streams so quickly that that wheel would turn so fast it would fly off of its axle, and it kind of demonstrates the point that the gradual flows that you see when you have a little bit less impervious surfaces in your watershed they're stable and a little bit more dependable, both for the purposes of human use and for the ecology of the rivers. Because nowadays, big storm events that cause large sediment escapes, I mean, that's the real problem with the South Rivers recovery and most of Anne Arundel County. We don't have massive, large scale, like chicken operations and other agriculture operations that can cause problems here. And we don't have lots of heavy industry or, hydroelectric dams here or anything like that. It's all about stormwater runoff is what is causing the problems in the Southwest and Road rivers and the Magothy and the Severn too. And that stormwater is most damaging when it comes in a big pulse. It's too much at once. And so that's why so much of the Federation and other watershed groups, our restoration work is designed around the mantra to slow it down, spread it out, and soak it in, the stormwater that is, because if you can do that, you can relieve some of the stress that these rivers are facing every day. And as I mentioned earlier, those big sediment plumes, they stick around for a few days, and sometimes that's all it takes to have, an acute lethal situation for fish that could get trapped up in a creek because the sediment plume chokes off the end of it, and then their dissolved oxygen fades out and you can have a fish kill. And of course, smothering underwater grasses and oysters, those two habitats are so vital for young fish and crabs to hide from predators, and they're so important for reducing erosion along shorelines. And with the oysters, they filter algae and nutrients and sediments out of the water, and with underwater grasses, they photosynthesize and put oxygen into the water. And they're two absolutely vital pieces of a complex puzzle to restore and protect these waterways. And it's been a challenge, but recently there has been progress made the past 20 or 30 years, but it is incremental. And with population projections as they are, the Chesapeake region the watershed already has 18 million people living within it, and that is a heavy load to carry. We've got one of the larger watershed to waterway ratios, meaning that the land draining through the Chesapeake is larger proportionally to the Chesapeake than many other river systems and other estuaries watersheds are. And with the mid-Atlantic being as well populated as it is, it presents an ongoing challenge, and we really need to be able to accelerate our restoration efforts to even hold the line with the impacts that we can expect from continued population growth in the area. I don't know what the rate of change was over time in terms of European expansion in the area, but I know it must have been relatively quick from early settlements in the 1600s to Annapolis becoming a new nation's capital a couple 175 years later. But that population growth has not dipped.
No, not at all. Yeah, I mean, here at London Town, we have, we're generally about 20 or so feet above sea level, but access to the water is through a few different ravines. And you've helped, Arundel Rivers has helped greatly with some of the stormwater management challenges we have here, because of course you get the flat land and then you just have those ravines where it just really runs into the water. And I can go down to the river on a stormy day, or not too long after a storm's passed, and see plumes. Sometimes unfortunately from our own property, as we're still trying to manage stuff on our end. Particularly these past few years, where the amount of rainfall per hour has slowly ticked upwards on average because of just different changes in the climate, and just trying to manage all of that is a challenge sometimes. The ravines here on our property, for the most part, they led to ferry crossings to go across the river. So they were kind of considered public right-of-ways. And so there was a vested interest in trying to make certain that they were travelable. So you could move on them. So in the colonial period, you would have people appointed as road overseers to keep these different roads, available for people to use. And so here in London Town, we were the South River 100, and I don't know enough about it, but I do know one of the times I was reading the historical documentation, the South River Road Overseer is specifically tasked by the Anne Arundel County Court to fix the road at the ferry crossing, because it's in a ravine and it's just been deteriorating so much because of runoff and human use that they need to fix it. So there's those nuggets of information that kind of get at what you're talking about, in the colonial period through today.
Yeah, that road overseer might be the region's first professional stormwater professional, beginning a long legacy of some very fine colleagues and professionals in the area that are working these days to make sure that those sort of heavily erosive ravines can be shored up and that kind of sedimentation can stop, because we need to give the river a breather if it's ever going to be able to reverse the curve of degradation that has gone on over the decades. But thankfully, this year we've been seeing a starting in 2019, actually, we've been seeing a resurgence of underwater grasses in the south and in the road rivers. And so far this year, I haven't been out on the water as much as I would like for obvious reasons, but we have started our monitoring season as of last week. I'll be out on the Weston Road tomorrow, and we've been noticing lots of the early springtime grass called horned pondweed, which is a great sign. It doesn't last as long as some of the other species of underwater grasses that grow in the area, but it is sort of a harbinger of good things to come. It will help a lot of times you'll see longer living grasses crop up in the same areas after the horned pondweed detaches from the bottom. And so it shows the conditions are right, that the clarity is such that the plants can get light through the water, that the river bottom is firm enough that the roots can hold on. These plants do not grow very well, and if they do grow, they don't stay very long when the sediment they're growing in is so loose that one heavy tide surge can disrupt the bottom and free their entire root structure from the bottom of the river. So it's good to see the bottom firming up a little bit. That's also a really vital part of the puzzle for restoring oysters. They need firm bottom to live on too. They can't survive in mud. They're not like clams, they build three-dimensional structures off of the bottom of the river to grow, and they create the sort of reefs that Captain Smith discussed in his diary. There were times when these first European vessels plying the Chesapeake would run aground on the oyster reefs, that they were so huge, and they'd just have to wait for the next tide. And I don't envy those sailors the cuts they must have gotten trying to shove their boats off of these oyster reefs, because oysters can get pretty sharp, especially once they create that three-dimensional structure and are allowed to grow unfettered. But anyway, it's really nice to see the underwater grasses returning, but unfortunately right now, we had some pretty heavy rain over last weekend, and the rivers all throughout the county are looking pretty brown. They seem to be experiencing an algal bloom. Those algal blooms are normal for the Chesapeake, but they are coming earlier and earlier in the year, which is not a good sign. It's another piece of evidence of the gradual warming of the climate. But they cause, apart from the discoloration of the water, they cause really high pH levels and a sort of boom and bust cycle of super saturated oxygen, and then a crash where the oxygen goes away, and that can cause the fish kills I mentioned earlier. If a school of fish like herring or alewives or something gets chased up into a creek by a school of rockfish or something, and they hide out up there, but then over the course of the day, the oxygen levels plummet, then they get trapped and they can die en masse. And that's the sort of thing that obviously we need to work to combat. And the only way we can do it, once the algae is growing, we can't go through with a skimmer and take it out. That's not how it works. You got to stop the nutrients that fuel those algal blooms from getting in the water in the first place. And preventing erosion, like the road, what was the title? Road Overseer?
Overseer, yeah.
Is the sort of way that we need to combat this problem. And it starts with all of us. One of the things that I've been asked by a bunch of people since the pandemic response has been in place is, well, I'm stuck at home these days. What can I do that's good for the river? And every bit of land in the watershed of the river is super important for protecting its health. And the way to start is to make sure that whatever is running off of your land is reduced. And if you can't reduce it, you got to make sure that it's clean. And that means not having nutrients in it. That means no fertilizing lawns, and trying to reduce runoff when you can by putting rain barrels and stuff on your house, and considering other longer term kind of more permanent structures like a bioswale along the edge of the road on your property, or a rain garden at the low end of your land, and things like that. There are definitely things that people can be doing when they're done reading up on the history of the region and want to get some exercise. They can go out and pull some native or pull some invasive vines off of their trees and give space to the natives and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, we've, here in London town, we have a green roof on our visitor center that you and Chesapeake Bay Trust helped us kind of put in. And yeah, it's just kind of interesting here being on the river at our location, seeing what we can do as best as we can to try to reduce the runoff, what works and what doesn't work. And it's just a long battle sometimes, of course, with all the different surfaces that we're dealing with, and then just how water is funny in that it goes one way one day, and then the rainfall pattern shifts just enough that it goes a slightly different way. And you're like, what just happened? So yeah. But we have that a wetland area near our parking lot that you all helped put in a few years ago, and I was there last week. Biggest bullfrog I've seen in a long time was enjoying that wetland area. So it's just kind of fun to see the wildlife that's attracted to them as well.
Yeah, London Town has been such a great partner with the Federation over the years. I've always enjoyed going there, as I mentioned, to do our report card presentations or to have fundraisers and things. And we've shared some really good, staff and interns have worked in both places. And it's always nice to have someone who understands kind of a horticultural perspective from working in London Town's wonderful gardens, and be able to apply that kind of knowledge to gardening in the broader watershed, in a sense, in terms of understanding native plants and their impacts, and being able to identify non-natives and exotics and things like that. And it's so nice that London Town has been such a willing partner with respect to the actual land on the grounds. It's taken so long for the Chesapeake to reach the point that it has reached at its low point, and it's going to take a long time for us to bring it back to. I don't expect to see the sorts of oyster reefs that John Smith would have seen any time in my lifetime, but maybe 5 or 6 generations down the road, we could have something like that again.
Yeah, and I know that'll take quite a while. A question I have for you is, your perspectives. You're obviously on the water a lot because of what you do, and something that's kind of been in the back of my mind is that today, we have such an intensive road and bridge system. You were just talking earlier about the South River Fork, and it's just a little like muddy patch that you can cross in just 10 seconds. That our road system today allows folks to zoom by these waterways without really a second thought, whereas it's really not until just this past century that we started to put that infrastructure in place. And I guess where I'm going with it is London Town was a big ferry crossing. There's no bridge built across the South River until the 1870s. And so even if you weren't living immediately on the water in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, or early 1900s, like your relationship with the water was more, the water, you had to deal with the water more than you do today, if I'm making sense. The Chesapeake Bay Bridge isn't built until the 1950s. So, to get to the Eastern Shore, you have to deal with a ferry, or you're driving all the way up and passing over the Susquehanna and the headwaters. And so, like, in the back of my mind, I've just always wondered about the fact that not a lot of people these days really interact with the water the same way that you do. You're on the water all the time. And so do you have maybe an impression of your time on the water? Like what realizations have come your way that maybe others might not have because they just cross water on a bridge in their car? Is that making sense? It's a heady question.
Yeah, well, your point is well made. Back in the olden days, the rivers weren't just something to look at and recreate on. They were the highways, and they were the port cities were the hubs of commerce. That if you wanted any kind of specialty item, if you needed medicine or medical attention, chances are you were going to a port city, because they were the bigger places. They were the areas where specialized skill sets could be developed in the population and specialized products could be made. And so, if you were waiting for a tanner to give you, a skin to make into a wine pouch or something like that, you were sitting on the city dock looking out at the Severn River in Annapolis if you're in this area. Nowadays, not many people are looking for wine skins anymore, but if you need something, you go on Amazon and you can get it out of your pocket. And so that disconnect is real, and I've been fortunate to be able to have a job that keeps me out on the water, but I was also very lucky to be born on a piece of property on the Severn River that gave me access my whole life. And so you cultivate a relationship and an appreciation that can guide your decision making. And I think that the best way that we can try to reverse that that dissolving of appreciation that happens for a waterway when you don't have any contact with it is to bring people to it. You can't bring the river to them, but you can bring them to the river. And so we at Arundel Rivers and at London Town too, you guys have outreach events and things where you get people to come out, and you are right on the water, and you can't tell the story of London Town without telling the story of the South River and the Chesapeake Bay. And we at Arundel Rivers are constantly, at least in normal times, getting groups of people together to come out to the river to plant marsh grasses or to take hikes. The Bacon Ridge natural area out in the headwaters of the South River is a really great place to take groups of people. The county has sponsored trail building there by volunteers over the past few years. Really nice trails to walk, and they take you by one of the headwater streams, Bacon Ridge branch of the South River, and it just raises questions and opens up the opportunity to discuss how what we've done on the land impacts the waterways. And for us, if we were leading a tour in Bacon Ridge, we would want to talk about how that fork of the South River's headwaters is named Bacon Ridge because there used to be a lot of hog farming in the area. And hogs can be fairly disruptive to ecosystems. They tend to like to eat a lot of roots and things, and so some other foraging animal might go and eat the leaves off of a plant and move on to the next one, and that plant will regrow some leaves. When you eat the root, that plant is dead. And they are also large animals, and so traversing up and down hillsides, as they were permitted to do, can cause a lot of erosion and stuff like that. And so, but those sorts of opportunities are really vital because, as I mentioned earlier, 18 million people, and most of them don't live within, an hour's drive of the river, let alone on it to be able to see it. And so, changing hearts and minds is another vital piece of the puzzle. Oysters and underwater grasses and stream restoration projects can only take you so far if the habits of the people living in the watersheds don't change. You're just doing triage at that point. You're not bringing the patient back to a state of robust health without the cooperation of the people who live here. And so it's one of the really sad parts of a number of sad parts of our current pandemic scheme is that we can't do that sort of engagement as effectively. And it really is important to work with schools too, because kids are much more able to adapt their perspectives to things. You know, once you get into your 30s and 40s and older, you've kind of figured, well, I know how to survive in this world and I know what I need to know and I'm going to go through the motions. But when you're younger, you're much more open. There's an osprey interrupting me flying overhead right now. But we need to make sure that we can keep engaging with youth and all stripes of folks to make sure that we still have places for that guy to go fishing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know that we've definitely shot past what we thought was going to be 30 or 40 minutes long, and I feel like we could continue to go on and on and on. So maybe there's some later times, but do you want to keep on, I guess, talk a little bit about what you all kind of need right now in the immediate future, and then I'll do the same about London Town, and we'll, I guess, sign off. And
yeah, you know, maybe we should do another one of these another time.
Absolutely.
But, yeah, so right now, you know, we at Arundel Rivers Federation have just started up our monitoring program again. We're going to keep our eyes out on the rivers and keep bringing information to the public and our supporters about what's happening out there, why the things that are happening, and how everyone can help. We do need support from our supporters and everyone else to continue to do that work. And I encourage anyone who's watching this who may not know about what we do to check us out on the web. We have a data map that they can learn about what's going on specifically in their areas, and to reach out to us if they have questions about the rivers, about what they can do, about what is good and bad, and all those sorts of things. We're a resource to the community, and I hope that folks will continue to engage with us, and we can all learn from each other like you and I are doing now.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, want to reiterate what Jesse just said to everyone listening, that you know, Arundel Rivers is a great organization that London Town's partner with, and we want them to be around for the next many decades as well, for us to continue to partner with. On our end at London Town, we too, like so many places, are having some challenges. We have the relief fund that folks can donate to. But to go back to Jesse's point earlier, like one of the sad impacts that's happened this past spring is we've had 0 school tours. And even though we can reach out virtually like we are doing right now in a variety of ways, I mean, actually, you know, engaging with school children or the public in person on a riverbank or on the river or in a place like that really, you know, allows folks to have a better understanding and appreciation of everything that we've been talking about today. So we're looking forward to being able to host people more intensively back on site at some point in the not too distant future, as far as school tours and group tours are concerned. We at London Town are open to the public, and so check out our website for our open hours so that you can kind of see some of the stuff that Jesse and I were talking about. But yeah, there's a whole bunch more. Hopefully we'll build a doc not too long from now, and we can continue with this fantastic partnership.
Indeed, I'm looking forward to it. Stay
All
safe.
right. Well, thank you.